Good morning, everybody. My name is Maggie Hartley. I am the Associate Director for Programming and Events here at the National D-Day Memorial in Bedford, Virginia. I am so glad that you guys have decided to tune in for our final installment of our World War Wednesday series. This series has been a unique opportunity to talk with museums throughout the state of Virginia, as well as England with the D-Day Story Museum in Portsmouth, about different connections to World War II across space and time. I do want to share a little bit about some upcoming events before I dive into today's program, which is Fighting with the French, looking at the French and American alliances since during the American Revolution and in World War II. We do have coming up our Poppy Peace Garden. It will be running from September 2nd through 13th. There is still time to purchase a poppy to have your loved one's name listed within the printed program. You can find more information about that at dday.org/poppy. We will have an educator open house for teachers who are interested in learning more about the educational offerings that we provide, as including our virtual programs on September 3rd and September 10th. And as we're approaching POW MIA Awareness Day, we will be doing a special program for that on September 19th. So stay tuned for that. For those of you guys who thoroughly enjoy our online lecture series, we'll be bringing back our lunchbox lectures on September 10th. World War II, some very interesting and unusual stories from World War II with Rusty Nix from the 100th World War I and 75th World War II Anniversary Commission for the state of Virginia. And then September 24th, we'll have The Lost Soldier with Chris Hartley, of no relation, as he discusses his book about what happened from the home front to the Hurtgen Forest with this one soldier, looking at his writings, his mail, all of that. So stay tuned to that. You can find more information about these programs at our website, which is www.dday.org. Now, without further ado, I would like to introduce our special guest today. She is no stranger to the National D-Day Memorial. Her name is Felicia Abrams. She is a graduate of UNC Chapel Hill with a BA in History and American Studies, and also UNC Greensboro with an MA in History and Museum Studies. Felicia has worked in museum education for over a decade. She is the on-site education manager for the Jamestown-Yorktown Foundation, directing student programming for Jamestown Settlement and American Revolution Museum in Yorktown. Prior to that, she was the Director of Education and Curation at the National D-Day Memorial Foundation. Felicia also serves as the Director of the Tidewater and Eastern Shore region on the Virginia Association of Museums Governing Council. So, hello, Felicia. So, how are things going with Jamestown and reopening?
Things have been very interesting, like all other museums. A lot of changes made to be able to safely welcome back our visitors, but the doors are open. And so please come out and visit us 7 days a week, 363 days a year. So plenty of time to visit. There are a few things coming up that people may be interested in. The first is the American Indian Heritage Festival in October. That's October 10th and 11th. And then we also have a number of virtual lectures and programs that are opening up, and you can find more information about those at our website at www.historyisfun.org. Oh.
Perfect. So I know things are busy here, things are busy there, adjusting to the pandemic. I really do appreciate you joining me today in discussing French and American alliances. I remember when I was telling you about this series that we wanted to do, and we started talking, and how this topic of our relationship with the French over the years came up. And so you want to go ahead and jump right on in?
Yeah, let's do it.
Perfect. So one of the things that we discussed with this was this propaganda poster that is on the screen about how Americans will always fight for liberty. I remember back when I was an intern with you, how we would discuss this propaganda poster because it was very prominent inside of the gift store. Do you want to share a little bit about the significance of it? Because the date 1778 isn't, what people would normally think of for.
Yes, so 1778 is a big year here in the American Revolution. One of the main reasons for that is the French alliance. The formal French alliance was put together in 1778, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that as we go through. But that's the formal one. That's not saying that there wasn't plenty of things going on before this point. But it really is with the French support and the French help that the American colonists, the ones who are rebelling against the British Empire, were able to be victorious just a few short years later at the Battle of Yorktown. So 1778 is that really critical year with that support from the French coming in a very, very big way to make the Battle of Saratoga possible as a victory and to lead more and more into what would become the United States.
Absolutely. In 1943, for the World War II side of things, really it's just when this propaganda poster was created. It was designed to really invoke that spirit of democracy about how Americans will always fight for liberty. And so this is very similar, but in a sense switched. The French helped us out with the American Revolution. Well, we're going to help them out as the Germans had taken over their homeland as well.
Exactly.
I think these are the four things that we agreed were kind of these similarities, common themes that we would like to discuss between World War II and the American Revolution. So you'll see these things both with Felicia's presentation on the American Revolution, mine with World War II. Of course, people will be different. There will be some interesting similarities, though, and we'll get to those towards the end. So let's jump into the American Revolution.
All right. So everyone's heard the saying, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And that really sums up this early relationship between France and the rebelling colonists. This is a multifaceted alliance of ideas, supplies, money, men. It's not Benjamin Franklin, it's Thomas Jefferson, who is looking back to Voltaire and other philosophers of the time, collecting on these ideas. That's only one part. That's the idea part. We're going to stick today to supplies, money, and men. And before we talk about this alliance and this treaty in 1778, we need to acknowledge the French relationship with North America as a former part of their empire, the colonies, and Britain prior to this call for independence. So let's start with that simple acknowledgement. Britain and France were bitter rivals for domination in Europe and wherever they held colonies throughout the 18th century. Although British North America rebels viewed France as a natural ally in the struggle for independence, just a few years prior to this, those same colonists were fighting against the French in the 7 Years' War. The English and Americans, had been taught to despise the government, religion, and culture of France in the years preceding the War for Independence. So the Treaty of Paris that ended the 7 Years' War in 1763 marked the end of French territorial ambitions in North America and the emergence of a mainly European foreign power in regard to Great Britain. As a result of the treaty, France lost Canada, called the province of Quebec, after 1763, but nearly all of its population was French, except for a few British newcomers. Another piece of land lost in the Treaty of Paris were the territories between the Ohio and the Mississippi River valleys. These territories extended all the way down to Louisiana, and this loss of land really embarrassed the French and imperiled their other holdings around the world. However, King Louis XV did not want to commit to another war. The 7 Years' War had been costly enough, but his successor, King Louis XVI, thought differently. And when he ascended to the throne, he's going to begin preparing for war against the British. And this had been an embarrassment for the French, so they were trying to take back some of this. The colonists, on the other hand, were looking forward to the potential of expansion, and that was one of the things they had been promised if they fought for the British during the 7 Years' War, is that they would be able to expand out and gain land in order to start growing more cash crops and bringing in more raw resources and materials that could be sent to England. But if you look at this image here, you see kind of a dark line between the colors of the colonies and the muted colors on the other side. This is the Great Proclamation line of 1763. This line set to keep the colonists from moving west until treaties could be made with the Native Americans and their protections could be guaranteed. You've got the promise of westward expansion, but now it's being locked down. As you can imagine, the colonists weren't too happy about this, and displeasure was really growing at that time. Despite any hostilities during the French and Indian War, the colonists continued to conduct clandestine illegal trade with France and the French West Indies. Trade laws at this time is based on something called mercantilism, and this system really exploited the colonists for the benefit of the mother country. So British received raw goods from their different colonies and sold finished materials back to America. There was very limited trade and manufacturing in the colonies, as this was restricted. France was looking for any way to loosen the bonds between Britain and the colonies, and encouraged this as a way to potentially undercut British power at the time. In order for the French to openly help the American rebels, though, two conditions had to be met. First, the Americans had to declare independence. And the second was they had to show that they were capable of defending themselves against the British Army. Until those conditions were met, France would remain neutral in the American Revolution. So if I can get Maggie to switch over our slide here. There we go. So in March of 1776, so before July, this Congressional Committee of Secret Correspondence appointed a man named Silas Deane to the Secret Committee of Congress. So Silas is pictured there on the left-hand side. This committee was composed of Ben Franklin, Benjamin Harrison, John Dickinson, John Jay, and Robert Morris. Deane was commissioned to go to France and there to transact such business, commercial, and political as we have committed to his care in behalf and by authority of the Congress of the 13 United Colonies. So we know about Ben Franklin and his stories in France, but what about Silas Deane? This may not be someone you've heard of before. Silas Deane was born in January of 1738 in Connecticut to a blacksmith. He obtained a full scholarship to Yale and graduated in 1758. After that, he was employed by a tutor, and one of his students was Edward Bancroft, and he's really important during the war, and we will come back to him in a bit because he's a very interesting character. In 1761, Deane was admitted to the bar and practiced law. He eventually married, and he married a widow whose husband had been really involved with the thriving West Indian Trade Company. So he's marrying into money, and he is in this West India Trade Company at this point. Fast forward a few years, Deane will arrive in France in May of 1776 under the guise of a commercial agent, which makes perfect sense given what his job is. The official cover provided by Congress was that he was there to purchase goods to trade with Native Americans and would be paid up to a 5% commission. Deane was instructed to apply first to the French government to secure certain military supplies, and if they refused, purchase those from private sources. So he's going in saying he's looking for one thing, but he's actually going in looking for military help in 1776. Now, upon his arrival, and according to instructions from Dr. Franklin, Deane wrote to now Dr. Edward Bancroft, his former tutor who was living in London. He also contacted another individual who was living in Paris who introduced Deane to the French foreign minister, who put him in contact with a man by the name of Beaumarchais. And we're going to talk about him in just a minute. Now, Silas Deane really starts to disappear in favorability, and by December of 1776, his status is going to change within his role in France, and he's going to be part of a 3-member commission But he's going to be joined by Benjamin Franklin, who is now in charge of this commission and who's going to be leading this mission to really try to encourage the France to actively back and support, or the French to actively back and support the colonies. And he's there with another name by the name of Arthur Lee, who we all know here in Virginia as part of the Lee family. Now, who are some other key figures for the French? We've got King Louis. King Louis XVI, who was born in August of 74, he is actually the grandson of King Louis XV, and he would succeed to the throne in May of 1774. So unlike his grandfather, Louis XVI spent time preparing for war against the British. He really wanted to right this wrong that he felt had been done during the 7 Years' War and try to get back some of the prestige for France. But it's his approval of French military and financial support for the American colonists that led to the foreign policy success. However, the borrowing required to pay for helping and supporting the American Revolution really drove the government into the brink of bankruptcy in France. The other man pictured here, the one who has the blue on, he is the Comte de Vergennes, a lifelong diplomat and ambassador to European country. He was appointed the Minister of Foreign Affairs by King Louis in June of 1774. And he is the one who is really supporting these rebellious colonies and trying to get the king and convince the king to openly support this cause. So he is the true ally who is talking to the king and pushing for this support. So what does this alliance look like? At first, this is covert aid. Vergennes was carefully monitoring the correspondence of his agents, both in London and the American colonies, during the early year of the War for Independence. Remember, the American Revolution is more than just the war. It's all sorts of ideas and thoughts and political action that's taking place. The war begins in 1775 with that Battle of Lexington and Concord. In September of 75, Vergennes is going to send one of his men on a secret mission to America. This person was instructed to meet with colonial leaders and assess the chance for success of this rebellion. This is unheard of. A colony rebelling against its motherland, especially Britain at the time, this is the strongest European power. So his report arrived in February of 1776 and advocated for this support, saying if we back them, we really believe they can win. Vergennes recommended to the king that France began offering substantial support. However, the French Minister of the Navy at the time opposed intervention because of the potential cost. He was worried about the cost that had been procured, in the last war that was only a few years ended at this point. But the king overruled those objections, and by April of 76, ordered the military to begin preparing for war. This is really important because he is going to order the construction of new ships and equipment for the army. These ships are going to be really, really important as growing a navy, because that's the one thing the colonists really lacked. April of 1776, we're still months before the signing of the Declaration of Independence, so that first node that needed to be approved of for the French, the first requirement they had that the colonies declare independence, still hadn't been met. But this is almost a year to the day after the shots were fired at the battles of Lexington and Concord. Covert efforts took place for almost 2 years through Beaumochet. Beaumochet, who is the son of the king's watchmaker, wrote a lengthy memo to the king outlining why France should support these colonies. He emphasized not only the need for arms, but the need for engineers as well, so the Americans could better defend themselves. This isn't just going to be giving them the supplies they need, but actually helping the Americans build up their defenses. Beaumochet collaborated exclusively with Silas Deane. He proposed a plan to create a new trading house, which would act for a front for the French government. When initially rejected, a modified version of this plan eventually came to place, and a new company was created. This would conceal from the world that the early supply ships to the Americans. And this began in 1776. The company would receive a few million dollars from France and another from Spain. And this is really important about the Spanish coming in, but a topic for another day. 1 second, please. This company would provision the Americans with arms and munitions. Oh, I have something in my throat, Maggie. Alrighty. This company would provision the Americans with arms, munitions, and objects of equipment and whatever they needed to support the war. So, what does this trading firm send? By the fall of 76, this fictitious trading firm had procured and shipped nearly 300,000 pounds of gunpowder, 30,000 muskets, 3,000 tents, more than 200 pieces of artillery, and clothing for nearly 30,000 soldiers. That's a ton of equipment. By February of 1778, King Louis XVI signed the Treaty of Amity and Commerce and the Treaty of Alliance. The Treaty of Amity and Commerce, signed first, recognized the colonies as an independent nation and established a strictly commercial treaty between the two. Second, the Treaty of Alliance was a defensive alliance between France and the United States, which promised mutual military support. All right. So, these early supplies that the French sent, helped secure victory at the Battle of Saratoga. And that victory satisfied the second requirement from France to sign these two treaties. Now, a number of idealistic French aristocrats, some of you may have heard of one, the Marquis de Lafayette, he's been a really popular figure lately, were far too impatient to wait for their country to enter the war officially. So Lafayette and many others in 1777 came to America to volunteer as soldiers. That's one line of support the French gave. The grand strategy, though, envisioned by the Continental Congress and its generals, was to use French armed forces, especially the French Navy, to neutralize the existing British superiority on land and at sea, and thereby decisively defeat King George's forces in America. The first direct French military support to reach America was in July of 1778. And this was an expeditionary force of 4,000 soldiers and 16 ships. Now, the first two joint missions ended in failure due to a lack of communication and a lack of coordination. The Americans blamed the French for the botched attack. And when the admiral and his fleet returned to Boston for repairs, anti-French feelings were so great that a French officer was killed during a riot. This is, again, one of those interesting things about this time period is looking at how these countries and how these people were enemies not that long ago and really getting them to work together. These failures are due to this cultural difference in between the new allies. The admiral and his aristocratic officers were scornful of the citizen soldiers they encountered in America and treated them as inferiors. By 1778, the British had shifted their base of operations to the southern states. The original admiral returned to France, and as a result of the failures, many Americans had become disillusioned with the French alliance. And some even began to expect the French intentions of joining this war. Growing ill will toward the French was only counterbalanced by the money and supplies that continued to arrive. The only encouraging development was the arrival of a second expeditionary force under the command of Rochambeau. This arrived in 1780 in July. Rochambeau had a very small fleet and about 5,500 well-equipped soldiers. They were blockaded in Rhode Island by the British Navy. Unlike the previous admiral, Rochambeau took great pains to cultivate good relations with him between the American allies and treated General Washington as his equal. After conferring with General Washington in the spring of 1781, Rochambeau and his 4 regiments marched overland to join up with the Continental Army near White Plains, New York. His small fleet, which had state-of-the-art siege artillery aboard, remained in Rhode Island, still behind that blockade. Washington's initial plan was to use the combined American and French forces to force the British out of New York City and the surrounding areas. The situation changed dramatically, however, when in August of 1781, Rochambeau learned that the Admiral de Grasse and a large French fleet, as well as some additional French infantry, would soon be arriving in the vicinity of the Chesapeake Bay. The stage is becoming set. De Grasse was prepared to support a military campaign in the area, but not willing to go as far north as New York. And he warned that he had to return to the West Indies by mid-October, so this isn't a long time that he's going to be in this region. This news was to set the stage for the final and decisive military campaign of the American Revolution. Yorktown, Virginia, October 1781. After digging trench lines and preparing, all batteries of the Continental forces opened fire with a terrible roar on the morning of October 10th. These batteries fired 60 cannons and mortars until 10 p.m., really silencing the sound of enemy guns. As an advancement, the Allied forces decided to capture 2 redoubts on the night of October 14th. The French would take Redoubt 9, the Continentals would take Redoubt 10. The following day, the defense is complete. All forces mounted more than 100 pieces of heavy ordnance that had been in continual operation. The incessant cannonade caused the whole peninsula to tremble. General Cornwallis called for a cessation of arms to discuss the terms of capitulation. The defeated British army marched out of Yorktown on October 19th. With the defeat at Yorktown, the war was effectively over. King George had lost his support, and peace negotiations would soon begin. Now, under the terms of that alliance, neither ally was supposed to negotiate independently of each other with the British. The American peace commissioners, however, quickly discovered that their goals in ending the war were different than that of the French. Congress had instructed the American delegates to follow the lead of the French in their negotiations, and the French foreign minister thought further war may weaken the British and allow for conquest of additional colonies in the Caribbean. Remember, France had been embarrassed. They were looking to get back at the British. Regimes also worried about the potential power in the United States. The Americans wanted to end the war as quickly as possible, and they were worried about the potential French reoccupation of Canada. As a result, the Americans decided to negotiate directly with Britain. They were able to gain considerable concessions from the British because of this. Their independent negotiations, however, caused considerable French resentment and laid the foundation for Franco-American tensions during the coming decades. While France was disappointed in the treaty negotiations, the important effect of the American Revolutionary War on the French people themselves. So the success of the American colonists in establishing a free government had a great influence upon the French mind during the years before the French Revolution. And once the French Revolution began in 1789, the American government decided to draft a statement of neutrality and not step in and help. Now, without the direct and indirect assistance of France, it is doubtful the Americans could have won the war for independence. From 1776 to 1783, France supplied the U.S. with millions in cash and credit. France also committed 63 warships, 22,000 sailors, and 12,000 soldiers to the war. And these forces suffered relatively heavy casualties as a result. The French national debt incurred during the war contributed to the financial crisis France experienced in the late 1780s And that was one factor that brought on the French Revolution. In the end, the French people paid a very, very high price for helping America gain its independence. So that wraps up the American Revolution. And
perfect. So let's jump ahead a few, well, I guess in a sense, about 150 years ahead to World War II. So things looked a little different. It was almost a reversal of an alliance with the French and the Americans as you're coming into World War II. One thing I do want to note is in the 1920s, there actually had been a big push of anti-Americanism within France. France really wanted to stick to its traditions, its history, its culture, and saw that the rise of Hollywood and modernism was a threat to that. And so really ahead of World War II, there wasn't much favorability among the French public of the Americans. Of course, this would change as we got closer to the Americans entering World War II. And in the late 30s, as the threat of Nazi Germany was becoming more apparent and more real for the French people, FDR had a long interest in France. And due to a friendship, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a minute, he ended up starting to supply them with airplanes in 1938, just 2 years before the invasion of France. Now, the United States, the nature of the alliance is very tricky. If you've even researched de Gaulle at all, you know that it has not been an easy alliance from the late 30s, really up until the French and Americans take Paris. It was very dicey up until that point. And the U.S. actually had attempted to maintain diplomatic relations with Vichy France up until 1942. So they tried it for 2 years, and then that's when it became a puppet of the Nazi regime. And FDR, against the State Department advice, pulled relations with Vichy France and directed it towards Free French at this time. Now, of course, one of your key people is going to be Franklin Roosevelt, the President of the United States. I'm not going to go into a whole bio about him. Many of you guys, I'm sure, are very familiar with World War II and know quite a bit about his role in that. I do want to note that his friendship with Baron Amari de la Grange is the key factor ahead of, oh, sorry about that. I think we had just a little bit of a technical difficulty. So if you missed that, it was Baron Amari de la Grange who would be key in French assistance ahead of the invasion of France. And of course, as we know, the Americans did not enter World War II officially until the attack at Pearl Harbor in December of 1941. Of course, there were different Lend-Lease Act and so forth that allowed us to assist the Allies. But this was something that very much was arranged in advance, where they would be sending these airplanes. Now, Franklin Roosevelt, ahead of this, had always had what we call an internationalist view. He believed that in this modern world, that it was very important for the nations to cooperate, and seeing this as an international economy, as international relations. This was very much his focus during this time. His counterpart, the leader of the Free French, Charles de Gaulle, a very controversial character, I should say. But to the French, he's considered to be the second most popular French president in modern history. But in his dealings with the Americans, he was always constantly on the verge of losing Allied support. And he was not easy to get along with. Compromise was not in his vocabulary. However, he did play a very significant role in trying to defend the French ahead of the invasion of France. It was really at his insistence that they built up their armored divisions. So, of course, the Americans were helping with the air. It was Charles de Gaulle who was leading the way with the armored divisions. It was almost too little too late. And we'll talk more about that in a bit. But that was a very important key thing before you have Free France and the Vichy France government. As I was saying earlier, his relationship with Washington was always strange. It actually would not be until the French and Americans had taken Paris that de Gaulle would finally recognize de Gaulle's provisional government as the official government of France. Of course, you know that he was always insistent on negotiating with the Vichy government, and even had, how do I word it? He had tried to even have relations with the Free French forces, but instead of focusing on de Gaulle, would focus in on one of his generals, Giard. I don't know if I pronounced that correctly. And he considered him to be the leader of France instead of de Gaulle. That's how tense this relationship would be. And in a sense, it is almost more of a, I would say, tactical strategy to support France, an alliance in the sense of defending Europe as a whole, versus, as you saw with the American Revolution, where they were very much keen on getting the Americans their freedom and having another ally against their mutual enemy, the British. Now, two other key players in this, especially thinking about D-Day and the invasion of, or in the liberation of Paris, you have Generals Patton and Eisenhower, who are pictured here. Neither of them were very keen on their French, I guess, I can't think of the word right now, but counterparts. There we go. And so Eisenhower did give de Gaulle his word that he would allow de Gaulle to lead the invasion or the liberation of Paris. He had no interest in Paris. It was considered to lack tactical value in the grand scheme of things of liberating Nazi Germany. And even more so with Eisenhower, he had considered the victory at Normandy to be the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. And so he didn't consider this to be of real value to the end game. Eventually, Patton, of course, would come in with the Third Army that swept across northern France. It campaigned in Lorraine for some time, but it was really one of the least successful campaigns of Patton's career. While in Lorraine, he annexed Major General Philip Leclerc's battalion into his army. And so let's talk a little bit about Leclerc here for a second. It always reminds me of the Pink Panther whenever I see pictures of Leclerc. But he did not respect his American counterparts, much like de Gaulle and Roosevelt. This is a very tense relationship. They really didn't like each other, but they understood the mutual benefit of freeing France for defeating Nazi Germany. So he thought the Americans did not know what they were doing on the field. And after being more trouble than help, Patton finally was like, hey, go liberate Paris. We'll flank from the west. You go from the east. And so eventually the French 2nd Armored Division was leading the way with Leclerc. And Leclerc was ecstatic at this thought because being a part of the Free French forces, he wanted to take this opportunity that he saw as this major victory in wiping away the humiliation of the Vichy government from French history. So like I've said before, really the biggest pre-American involvement in World War II support was the selling of French airplanes to the air forces. During the Spanish Civil War in the mid-30s, they saw the inferiority of the German air forces. You have the Blitzkriegs, they have better warplanes, they have more efficient factories. And so they knew that this was going to be the biggest threat if the Germans decided to take over more of Europe. So Roosevelt, of course, was very forthcoming and decided to secretly sell the most modern American airplanes to France. And then Paris at the same time was trying to expand its own aircraft production. But as I've said time and time again, that was too little, too late. So you have the invasion of France in the 1940s, and it really was shocking for the Americans. They did not expect France to fall as quickly as it did. And so when you're thinking through this, that really leads to the biggest support for taking France back. So the goal of liberation is going to be key following 1940 through 1944. Of course, after the Americans gained Normandy, the Allies knew it was only a matter of time before the Nazis would lose. And then one key point of this, of course, we said that Paris was lacking in tactical value. However, the historic and cultural components of Paris was deemed important by the Americans. There had actually been talk that Hitler was considering bombing it to resemble a second Stalingrad. And so the Americans and allies did not want this to happen. And so you did see Patton's armies provide support along with the French forces for this. Now, the aftermath of all of this is not quite as dismal as what happened after the American Revolution. I think the French come out a little bit better with this. Of course, living conditions and inflation in France were worse in 1945 than during and before the war. To give you guys some perspective, 25% of Paris was destroyed. And there was another statistic I saw that many of the bakeries in the Normandy region were pillaged. And so you have some very desperate conditions here. The U.S. Army is going to supply food for 1944 through just after the end of the war in 1946. And then with the Marshall Plan, you're going to start seeing loans and cash grants that will end up equaling almost $5 billion from the end of World War II through the early 50s. And one of the most exciting portions of this is a part of the Marshall Plan. American exceptionalism was really pushed during this period, so much so that they had over almost 5,000 businessmen leave France to go over to America to tour American factories, farms, stores, and offices. And considering that 20 years before, there was this very anti-American tone, you are seeing these businessmen get very excited and impressed with the prosperity of American workers. One thing that was interesting to me was they were impressed that American workers could purchase an automobile in 9 months of wages versus in France, which would cost 30 months of wages. And while some French businesses, I think, stuck to that anti-American ideal, you saw many of them start to embrace Americanism, and they ended up, especially chemical oils, electronics companies, really embracing this, and their industries began to boom. And another funny thing, we talked about how Hollywood played a role in anti-Americanism. The French film industry would eventually embrace Hollywood and see its own industry soar following World War II. So as you guys know, there were a lot of similarities, a lot of differences. Felicia and I will talk about those for a little bit before we switch gears to questions from the public. If you are interested in submitting a question, please put that within the comment section. I do know you may have to add to log in order to submit a question. So if you're watching without an account on Facebook and YouTube, I apologize, but you do have our emails on this slide currently. So please feel free to email both Felicia and I. So Felicia, I have a question for you. So based off of what we have discussed, who has the alliance been more beneficial for, France or the United States?
It's really hard. That's a really hard question because for the, looking at the American Revolution, this alliance was really beneficial for the Americans. This is what they needed to be successful in their cause for liberty. And what they give back to the French, there's some trade that goes back, but really the biggest thing is these ideas, which will run right into the French Revolution, which brings on the Reign of Terror. Can't say that's a great consequence of everything with what happens during that time period. King Louis XVI loses his head during this. So making an alliance with a king who has now lost his head is where do you go from there? At this point, and then looking at it from the World War II side, really the French needed the American troops to come in and help liberate their country. So if you're looking at both of them, in the end, I think you may have a wash in the end as to where the alliance really goes. So what do you think?
I'm kind of with you there. I think if I had to choose, I would say the Americans more so. But I mean, World War II was incredibly beneficial for France. I mean, they got their country back. They were liberated, and that's huge. I mean, you still see today French people are incredibly grateful for the Americans and what they've done. They still recognize Americans, even as young as I am, for what the greatest generation did with liberation. And so, you know, yeah, I think it's a wash, but if I had to pick, it's slightly towards the Americans, because at the end of the day, it was a tactile necessity to liberate France in order to defeat Nazi Germany and to keep them from potentially even invading the United States one day. So,
yeah.
So another question for you before we switch over to any questions from the public is, what would you say are the similarities between the Revolution and World War II alliances?
The similarities between the alliances, it's supplies and men. When it comes down to winning a war, if you don't have the supplies necessary to be successful, that really hurts your chances. So having the supplies from France, having FDR send the aircraft over, that's really the kind of key ideal here. Key thing that's tying both of these countries together is this willingness to provide supplies. Sure, there may be some ulterior motives behind seeking out the alliance, but at the end of the day, it's what's going to happen and how is it most beneficial for everybody involved. Yeah.
Exactly. And I think, too, to add to that, kind of going back to that original propaganda poster we shared, liberty is that similarity,
Right.
The American colonists wanted their liberty. The French people, after the invasion of Germany, wanted their liberty. And so that was very much a common thread around that. So let's see.
All right.
There is a question. There's a very long question, so let me read through it and then we can kind of tackle it from there. So I remember the riots there were around 1968, and also relations with the U.S. were strained after France left NATO. I'm sure most French agreed with de Gaulle, and Americans loved France anyways, but President Johnson and Nixon were unpopular over the way they conducted the Vietnam War. They remain unpopular. So how did de Gaulle's popularity make such great recovery after the riots? So I can try to tackle this. I will say that I'm not a de Gaulle expert, but I do know that de Gaulle was also very popular as a result of his use of the media. He knew how to be in touch with the people, how to connect to the people and what they wanted. And you have, I guess, in a sense, you could compare de Gaulle really to George Washington. He was leading the charge of freedom, of independence. And so he was very much respected as a result of that. Following World War II, he would take probably almost a decade off, if I remember correctly, from politics following the end of World War II, and come back. And still I believe some of the parties of France still very much find themselves rooted in de Gaulle's values and beliefs. And so I don't know if you want to try to tackle that as well.
Yeah, what I was going to say is it'd be a great follow-up panel where we can add, a person who does more of the Cold War, Vietnam era history into the conversation here, to kind of tie in this French-American alliance all the way up through conflicts going into Vietnam.
Absolutely. And I mean, it's even interesting to look even at, for the most part, over the years, American and French relations have been fairly positive. It wasn't until the global war on terror, where there were some disagreements on whether or not that should have been fought, that you saw it starting to lessen a little bit. So we do have another question. Lafayette was popular in America for decades after the war. How did Lafayette fare with his countrymen over the course of his life?
I'm not 100% sure. I can say you're absolutely right. Lafayette was extremely popular in America. When he came back to visit, the red carpets were rolled out. There were carriages to take him around. There's a cannon with the Lafayette seal on it. One of the cannons from, one of the British cannons with the Lafayette markings on it. So Lafayette is an extremely popular figure. He is like the Beatles of his time, for landing here in America after the Revolution. I know that, Robespierre and the Jacobians really attacked Lafayette as the tool of the king during the French Revolution. I know that when he was deposed, the Assembly passed a bill of impeachment against Lafayette. He did flee France and he was captured. But I'm not really sure how the general public felt about Lafayette during this time period. I will admit I need to do more reading on the French Revolution to see how Lafayette fares.
Absolutely. So we do not have any more questions currently in the queue. I do want to thank you, Felicia, for taking the time, I'm sure out of your very busy schedule, to talk a little bit about French and American alliances from American Revolution to World War II. So,
absolutely, and thank you for having me. This has been great.
Perfect. So for everyone, if you missed at the beginning, we do have some upcoming lectures soon, and I hope that you guys will join us. Thank you so much for tuning in today. Bye.
Bye.